Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we are taking an absolute dive into our own biology. We're going to zoom all the way down into this hidden, microscopic universe that is literally operating silently inside of you every single second of the day.
Seriously, take a quick second and just look at your hand. Look at the skin. Flex your muscles a bit. Have you ever actually stopped to wonder what exactly is building this complex, living machine that you inhabit? You know, it's so easy to just look at the surface. But right beneath that skin is a complete architectural marvel, and it's made up of trillions of tiny, living bricks. Okay, let's get right to it. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the building blocks of life, then move to discovering the cell, explore cell diversity and shapes, take a step inside the cell, and finally wrap up with cellular transport mechanisms.
Part 1. Building blocks of life, from macro to micro.
So, to find the absolute ultimate foundation of living organisms, we can't just look at the whole picture, right? We have to zoom in step by step and peel back the layers. You start at the top, with you, the complete organism. You're run by these incredibly complex organ systems, which are, of course, made of individual organs. Zoom into those organs, and you'll find tissues working together in tandem. And finally, if you take a microscopic slice of that tissue, you land at the absolute base level, the cell.
And that lands us right here at our core definition. The cell is the basic structural and functional unit of all living organisms. It is literally the physical scaffolding of your body, but it's also doing the heavy biological lifting to keep you alive. Basically, without it, nothing else exists.
All right, part 2. Discovering the cell, a microscopic history.
How on earth did we actually figure all this out? Because obviously, you can't see a cell with the naked eye. This whole journey kicked off way back in 1665. A scientist named Robert Hooke looked at a super thin slice of cork under a microscope, saw these tiny empty compartments, and decided to name them cells. Less than 10 years later in 1674, Anton van Leeuwenhoek observed the very first living, actively moving cells. Fast forward a bit to 1831, Robert Brown peers even deeper and discovers the nucleus right inside the cell. And all of this rapid discovery ultimately culminated in what we call the cell theory between 1838 and 1855, which basically established that all plants and animals are fundamentally made of these exact same tiny units.
But then, in 1855, Rudolf Virchow drops this absolute mic drop moment for the cell theory. He said, in Latin, omnis cellula e cellula, meaning all cells come from pre-existing cells. Life doesn't just spontaneously appear out of nowhere, it continuously builds upon itself. Think about that for a second. The cells dividing inside of you right now come from an unbroken lineage stretching all the way back to the very beginning of your existence.
Moving on to Section 3. Cell diversity and shapes. No two are exactly alike.
Now, you might be thinking a cell is just a tiny, boring little circle. No way. The extremes in the scale here are actually wild. On one hand, you have the absolute smallest living cell out there, a tiny bacteria called mycoplasma. But on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, an ostrich egg. Yeah, that massive, heavy egg you could hold in your hands is technically one single enormous cell.
And it's not just about size. Cells totally differ in numbers and shapes based on what their actual job is. Some organisms are perfectly fine being unicellular, like your everyday bacteria or amoeba. But humans, we are completely multicellular, boasting trillions of them. And their shapes are perfectly customized for their functions. A human ovum is spherical. Smooth muscle cells are spindle-shaped so they can contract efficiently. And my personal favorite, the neuron, or nerve cell in your brain. It's incredibly long and heavily branched, basically looking like a sprawling tree, so it can rapidly fire electrical signals across your entire body. Section 4. Inside the cell. The factory floor.
Okay, let's shrink down and step directly inside one of these things. It's basically a bustling, highly organized microscopic factory. At the outer border, you have the plasma membrane. Think of it like a selectively permeable security guard, deciding exactly what gets to enter and exit. Deep inside is the nucleus, the strict control center vaulting all your precious DNA. Filling up the empty space is the cytoplasm, which is this jelly-like fluid where all the internal machinery operates. Put all that living content together, and you have what we call the protoplasm.
But here's a crucial difference. Not all these cellular factories have the exact same kind of exterior walls. Plant cells, bacteria, and fungi have this extra, super rigid outer layer called a cell wall. It provides immense structural support. I mean, it's literally the reason a massive redwood tree can stand so tall without having a skeleton.
Animal cells, though, including ours, we don't have that wall. We rely completely on our flexible plasma membrane, which is what allows us to have dynamic movement.
Now, inside that cytoplasm float the organelles. These are basically the factory machines. And what's super interesting is how they're categorized entirely by their protective armor, or membranes. The most vital, high-security assets, like the DNA-holding nucleus and the energy-producing mitochondria, are locked behind a double membrane. The regular processing centers, like the Golgi apparatus, have a single membrane. Meanwhile, the tiny, hard-working builders, like ribosomes, operate completely out in the open with absolutely no membrane at all.
Finally, Section 5, Cellular Transport Mechanisms, the Gates of Life.
For this microscopic factory to actually survive, it has to breathe and eat, right? It's constantly pulling resources in and pumping waste back out. And this transport ultimately boils down to a fundamental concept in physics. Does the cell have to spend energy to make the move? Passive transport requires zero energy. Substances just naturally flow from an area of high concentration down to low concentration. It's exactly like rolling a ball down a hill. Active transport is the total opposite. Moving things against the grain is like pushing a heavy boulder up a hill, which requires the cell to spend its hard-earned energy, known as ATP.
Now, a really vital type of passive transport is osmosis. Specifically, let's talk about endosmosis. Endo means inside. So this is simply the process of water molecules naturally flowing from a higher concentration outside, straight through that semi-permeable membrane, and right into the cell. It's essentially the cell taking a desperately needed drink to stay hydrated.
On the flip side, we have exoosmosis. Exo meaning exit. This is water leaving the cell, moving out into a lower concentration environment. If you were to drop a cell into a highly salty liquid, exoosmosis kicks in fast. The cell will literally shrink and shrivel up as the water rapidly exits, which, by the way, is exactly the reason why drinking ocean water actually dehydrates you instead of quenching your thirst.
So that actually brings us full circle. From the macro level of your own two hands all the way down to the invisible plasma membranes and tiny organelles that are single-handedly dictating your survival. How will you think about the trillions of tiny control centers successfully operating inside of you at this very moment? It is an entire microscopic universe of factories, constantly dividing, transporting, and generating the energy that lets you live. Thanks so much for joining me on